Welcome to our channel. We're thrilled to have you with us. In today's video, we're diving into a powerful story that you won't want to miss. But before we begin, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let's hear your thoughts. If you enjoy today's video, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our next exciting chapter tomorrow. We've got plenty of incredible stories lined up, and you won't want to miss a single one. Let's jump into today's adventure. Defendant versus corrupt officer. This courtroom battle ends in an unthinkable twist. Officer David Harris had always been a man of unwavering confidence. At 38, he had seen it all: the dangerous situations, the high-speed chases, and the countless arrests. He knew how the system worked, how it typically sided with officers like him. He was a decorated police officer with years of service under his belt, and for him, the world was simple. Right was right, and wrong was wrong. There was no room for gray areas. Today, in a packed courtroom, Harris sat proudly on the witness stand. He was about to share his version of events, a version where the defendant, Jason Clark, a 32-year-old black man, had resisted arrest during a routine traffic stop. Harris spoke with a quiet arrogance, certain that his words would carry weight. After all, he had been in this position before. The system trusted him. The jury trusted him. The prosecutor trusted him. Jason Clark, on the other hand, sat at the defendant's table with an air of calm confidence. He wore a simple navy blue suit, nothing flashy, just a man in the midst of an unjust battle. As Harris continued to spin his version of the story, Jason sat quietly, listening, his fingers lightly tapping the desk in front of him. There was no anger in his demeanor, no emotion that would give Harris the satisfaction of a reaction. He was focused, and he knew he had a job to do. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a skeptical frown, sat behind the bench, observing the proceedings. He showed little reaction to the testimony, but had a keen eye on everything unfolding in front of him. The prosecutor, meanwhile, couldn't hide his smirk. After all, this case seemed like a no-brainer. Jason Clark was representing himself. No fancy lawyer, no professional defense team, just a man standing against the word of a decorated officer. It seemed like an easy win. When it was finally Jason's turn to speak, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. With quiet confidence, Jason stood up from the defendant's table and walked toward the center of the courtroom. His movements were deliberate, calm, and measured. He adjusted his tie, then turned to face Officer Harris, whose smug expression had yet to falter. "Officer Harris," Jason began, his voice steady and clear, "you testified under oath that I resisted arrest, correct?" Harris scoffed, looking down at Jason with a mixture of disdain and disbelief. "That's right," Harris said. "You were aggressive and tried to run. I had to use force to restrain you." Jason nodded slowly, acknowledging Harris's statement, but his eyes never left the officer. He walked over to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. With a calm motion, he flipped through the pages before holding up a document for the entire courtroom to see. "Your body cam footage, officer," Jason said, his voice unwavering. "It was released as evidence." A nervous ripple spread through the courtroom. Harris swallowed hard, his face reddening as the weight of the moment started to sink in. The prosecutor's smirk faded, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty. Jason continued, his eyes fixed on Harris. "Would you care to explain why in the video I was fully cooperative, had both hands on the wheel, and did not resist arrest at any point?" The room went silent. Harris fidgeted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable now. "Well, Harris stammered. "The footage might not capture everything." Jason cut him off, his voice sharp yet composed. "You also claimed that I had a broken tail light, which was your probable cause for pulling me over. Yet the footage shows my lights were fully functional. Are you saying the evidence is wrong, Officer Harris?" At that moment, the judge leaned forward, suddenly more engaged in the case than before. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that the case he thought was already won was starting to crumble. Jason wasn't finished. He walked up to the judge's bench and handed over another document. "Your Honor, this is a Full transcript of Officer Harris's prior complaints, Jason said. Multiple cases of racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct, all swept under the rug. And yet, he is testifying as a credible witness today. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor visibly shifted in his chair, no longer looking so sure of the outcome. Then, in a final move that left the room in stunned silence, Jason reached into his briefcase and pulled out one last document. "I hold a Juris Doctor degree from Harvard Law," Jason said, his voice calm but firm. "I have been a practicing attorney for 10 years, and am a professor of criminal law." The courtroom was stunned into silence. Officer Harris looked frozen, and the judge blinked in shock. The prosecutor dropped his pen, completely caught off guard by the revelation. Jason smiled, not in arrogance, but in quiet victory. "I may have come here as a defendant today," Jason continued, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "But I leave here as a man who has exposed the truth. I demand that this case be dismissed immediately, and that Officer Harris be investigated for perjury and misconduct." The judge cleared his throat, glancing at the prosecutor, who could barely meet his gaze. With a heavy sigh, the judge spoke. "Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Harris sat frozen, the reality of his career potentially unraveling, crashing down on him. Jason gathered his papers, nodded politely to the judge, and walked out of the courtroom, his head held high. Justice had been served. As the trial progressed, Jason Clark's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the growing tension in the courtroom. The lies being spun by Officer David Harris seemed to fall away with each passing moment. Jason had come prepared, not just with evidence, but with an unwavering resolve to stand up for the truth. It was clear that the tide was starting to turn, and Jason was in control now, not the decorated officer who thought the system would protect him. Officer Harris had been confident at the start, his words dripping with arrogance. He'd expected the usual response. The defendant, a black man without a lawyer, would be easy to discredit. Harris had testified about the alleged resistance during the traffic stop, painting Jason as a dangerous criminal. But as Jason stood up to question him, that carefully crafted narrative started to unravel. Jason's calm yet commanding presence was impossible to ignore. As he stood in the center of the courtroom, he cut through the noise of Harris's lies with simple, direct questions. His first move was to reveal the body cam footage, a move that stunned the entire courtroom. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Jason asked a question that resonated far beyond the walls of the courthouse. "Officer Harris," Jason said, holding up the footage, "you testified under oath that I resisted arrest, correct?" The officer's face turned pale as he stammered, but Jason wasn't done yet. He pressed further, showing the footage where Jason was calm, cooperative, and hands clearly on the steering wheel, contradicting Harris's accusations. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of an easy victory, sat up straighter in his chair. He exchanged a look with the judge, clearly uneasy about where this was headed. Harris, too, was visibly shaken, trying to backtrack but failing to recover his composure. Jason wasn't finished. With a steady hand, he flipped through the evidence on the table and produced a second document, the transcript of Officer Harris's prior complaints. The courtroom grew tense as Jason handed it to the judge. "Your Honor," Jason spoke with unshakable conviction, "this is a transcript detailing multiple complaints against Officer Harris, cases of racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct, all conveniently swept under the rug." The room was buzzing with shock, the murmurs growing louder by the second. The prosecutor's earlier confidence had evaporated, and the judge leaned forward, his silver hair catching the light. This wasn't just a simple case anymore. Jason had turned it into something much bigger. He wasn't just defending himself. He was exposing a corrupt officer, and he was doing it without missing a beat. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as Jason reached into his briefcase, pulling out one final piece of evidence, a document that would forever change the direction of the trial. He held it up for all to see. "I hold a Juris Doctor degree from Harvard Law," Jason said calmly. I have been practicing law for 10 years and am currently a professor of criminal law. I may have come here as a defendant today, but I leave here as someone who has exposed the truth." The courtroom fell into an absolute silence. Officer Harris's face turned crimson as the reality of his situation set in. He had underestimated the man he was testifying against. The prosecutor couldn't meet Jason's gaze, his eyes darting nervously as the weight of the revelation hit. Jason had no intention of letting them win by default. He had done his homework, and he was here to make sure the truth prevailed. Jason smiled, a quiet victory glimmering in his eyes. "I demand that this case be dismissed immediately, and that Officer Harris be investigated for perjury and misconduct." The judge, looking both surprised and contemplative, glanced at the prosecutor, who had nothing left to say. The tension in the room was palpable, and for the first time it was clear who held the power. With a heavy sigh, the judge spoke the words that no one expected to hear. Case dismissed. The room erupted into a chorus of murmurs, some shocked, some in disbelief. Officer Harris sat frozen, unable to process the collapse of his career. Jason, however, stood tall, gathered his papers, and walked out of the courtroom with his head held high. Justice had been served, but it was only thanks to a man who was brave enough to expose the truth, despite the odds stacked against him. The air in the courtroom felt thick with anticipation. Jason Clark had just turned the tide with his unyielding confidence, and now the prosecution and Officer Harris were on the defensive. It was clear that this was no longer a simple case of a traffic stop gone wrong. Jason had done the unthinkable. He had exposed Officer Harris's lies, and now he was going for the knockout punch. Jason's eyes never wavered from the officer. He could feel the weight of the courtroom's gaze on him. People who had once believed in Harris were now questioning everything they had heard. The doubt was palpable. Harris, who had walked in here thinking his word was the law, was now visibly sweating, his confidence shaken to the core. But Jason wasn't done. He had one final piece of evidence to present, one final act that would cement his place as more than just a defendant in this case. With calm precision, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a neatly folded document. As he unfolded it and held it up, the room went silent. "I may be the one standing here as a defendant," Jason began, his voice steady, "but I am also an attorney, a Harvard law graduate, and I've been practicing criminal law for 10 years. The moment those words hit the courtroom, you could almost hear the collective gasp. Jason had kept this hidden, his legal background known only to a few. The surprise of the revelation sent shockwaves through the room, and even Officer Harris couldn't hide his disbelief. Jason continued, his voice unwavering. "I have been a professor of criminal law, and as part of my practice, I have spent years studying the very system that I now stand before. So, don't mistake my calm demeanor for weakness. I know the law inside and out, and I know when justice is being corrupted." The prosecutor's smug smirk faltered for the first time. He hadn't prepared for this. The judge, too, seemed taken aback. For a brief moment, the courtroom was engulfed in silence as everyone absorbed the weight of Jason's words. The realization hit. They were no longer dealing with a defendant without resources or knowledge, but with someone who knew exactly how to navigate this legal battle. Jason walked back to the center of the room and faced the jury. He held up the last document, the one that could take everything down. "I have a full transcript here," he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "This transcript shows a history of complaints against Officer Harris, complaints about racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct. These are not just isolated incidents, they are a pattern, and yet, despite all of this, Officer Harris stands here today as a credible witness." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure how to recover from this. The air in the courtroom had changed. What was supposed to be a simple case of one man's word against another had become a full-scale expose of corruption. The room was divided now. Those who still sided with Harris were questioning their beliefs, and those who had always doubted the system were beginning to see something they'd longed to see for years: accountability. Jason's voice lowered. But it carried even more weight. "The truth doesn't lie, and neither does this footage," he continued, tapping the evidence table where the body cam footage sat. "I was fully cooperative, hands on the wheel, just as I've said from the beginning. Officer Harris's narrative is a fabrication, a lie designed to justify an unjust arrest. But the evidence doesn't lie." The courtroom was tense, everyone hanging on Jason's every word. The prosecutor had no rebuttal, and Harris sat motionless, realizing for the first time how precarious his position was. Jason stepped forward, his posture strong and unyielding. "I demand that this case be dismissed immediately, and I demand that Officer Harris be investigated for perjury and misconduct." The words echoed in the courtroom, each one carrying a finality that left no room for argument. Jason's demand was clear. Justice had to be served. The judge, who had been quiet and observant throughout the proceedings, cleared his throat, his gaze shifting between the prosecutor and Harris. He could no longer ignore the truth in front of him. After a long pause, the judge sighed deeply and addressed the room. "Case dismissed," he said, his voice firm. The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. The tension that had been thick for hours suddenly dissipated into disbelief and murmurs. The prosecutor looked as if he had just witnessed a wrecking ball take down his entire case. Harris sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, his career now hanging in the balance. Jason didn't wait for applause or recognition. He gathered his papers calmly, walked up to the judge's bench, and nodded respectfully. As he turned to leave the courtroom, he walked with his head held high, knowing he had done more than just defend himself. He had exposed the truth and stood up for justice. The courtroom was now alive with tension. The revelation that Jason Clark was not just a defendant, but a Harvard-trained attorney, had turned everything upside down. The once cocky prosecutor, who had been so sure of his victory, now looked like a deer caught in headlights. Officer David Harris, who had walked into the courtroom full of pride and confidence, was now visibly rattled. He fidgeted in his seat, unable to maintain the arrogance he had displayed earlier. The power had shifted, and the momentum was now firmly in Jason's hands. Jason's calm, methodical approach to the trial had exposed the cracks in Officer Harris's story. The body cam footage, the previous complaints of misconduct, and the transcript detailing Harris's history of racial profiling had dismantled any shred of credibility the officer had left. And now Jason had one final piece to present, a document that could bring everything crashing down. Jason didn't rush. He took his time as he carefully selected the last document from his briefcase. He could feel the weight of the room's gaze on him, but his focus remained unwavering. This was the moment he had been building towards, the moment when everything would come to light. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about exposing a system that had failed too many people for too long. With a steady hand, Jason held up the final piece of evidence. "Your Honor, this," he began, his voice steady and controlled, "is a full transcript of Officer Harris's prior complaints. Multiple cases of racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct. These complaints have been swept under the rug, ignored, and hidden from the public. But today they come to light." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge sat up straighter, his gaze fixed on the document in Jason's hand. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that the case they had thought was won was now in jeopardy. The prosecution had relied too heavily on the word of a decorated officer, without considering the possibility that he had a history of dishonesty. Jason handed the transcript to the judge, his movements deliberate. He didn't rush. This was his moment to make sure everyone in the room understood exactly what was at stake. Are we to believe that an officer with this history of misconduct is still a credible witness? Jason continued, turning to face the jury. A man who has repeatedly violated the very principles he swore to uphold? A man who has abused his power time and time again? And yet, we are asked to trust his word over mine. Jason's voice didn't waver, even as he delivered the final blow. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, It was as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Officer Harris sat frozen, unable to respond. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by the cold realization that Jason had not only exposed his lies but had also revealed the systemic issues within the very system Harris had sworn to protect. The prosecutor's face had drained of color. He glanced around the courtroom, desperately looking for something to grasp onto, but the case was slipping away from him. Jason's calm, unwavering presence was slowly, but surely, shifting the tide of the trial. Then came the final revelation. Jason wasn't just a man fighting for his innocence. He was a man fighting for justice. He reached into his briefcase once more, pulled out another document, and held it up for the court to see. This time, it wasn't just any document. This was a letter from Harvard Law, confirming Jason's qualifications as a professor of criminal law. "I hold a Juris Doctor degree from Harvard Law School," Jason announced, his voice now carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. "I have practiced criminal law for over 10 years, and I've taught future lawyers the very principles of justice that Officer Harris has ignored in his actions. So while I may have entered this courtroom as a defendant today, I leave here as a man who has exposed the truth." The shock on the faces of everyone in the courtroom was palpable. Officer Harris's career was now in jeopardy, and the prosecutor's case was in ruins. Jason had not only defended himself, but he had also exposed a corrupt system, a system that had failed to hold officers like Harris accountable for far too long. Jason turned to the judge, his face calm but filled with quiet determination. "I demand that this case be dismissed immediately, and that Officer Harris be investigated for perjury and misconduct." The judge, who had been silent throughout much of the proceedings, finally spoke. "Case dismissed." The words hung in the air, reverberating through the courtroom. The tension that had built up over the course of the trial suddenly evaporated, replaced by a collective sense of disbelief. The courtroom erupted into whispers, the murmurs of those who had just witnessed a monumental moment in the pursuit of justice. Jason, without a word, gathered his papers, walked to the judge's bench, and nodded respectfully. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. Justice had been served. And as he walked out of the courtroom with his head held high, he knew that he had done more than just defend himself. He had exposed the truth and taken a stand for those who had been silenced for far too long. The courtroom, still buzzing from the shock of the judge's decision, was a silent witness to Jason Clark's quiet victory. Officer Harris, once confident and arrogant, now sat motionless, his face pale, realizing the magnitude of what had just happened. The case was dismissed. His career was on the line, and as Jason gathered his papers, the full weight of the moment hit the room. Justice had been served, but for Jason, the victory wasn't about the case itself. It was about the truth. Jason turned to leave, his posture calm, his head held high. The murmurs of the courtroom faded into the background as he made his way to the exit. He knew that today, something had shifted, not just for him, but for the system that had failed so many before. Officer Harris's lies had been exposed, and the evidence against him was undeniable. But as Jason stepped outside the courthouse, the reality of what he had just done began to sink in. The air outside was crisp, cool against his skin, but Jason felt nothing but a quiet, steady pride. He had fought for justice not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the very system that was meant to protect them. The fight hadn't been easy. It had been brutal, full of uncertainty and risk. But now, as the weight of the victory washed over him, he realized the impact of what had just happened. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he had reclaimed something that was far more important than his own freedom. He had exposed the truth. He had brought justice to the courtroom, and in that moment, he knew that his fight was far from over. Days passed, and Jason's victory began to make waves. News outlets picked up the story, and what had seemed like an ordinary trial turned into a landmark case. Jason was no longer just a defendant. He had become a symbol of what it meant to stand up against corruption. People from all over the country reached out to him, offering support, sharing their own stories of injustice. Jason's name was now synonymous with courage, with truth. But as the media attention started to die down, Jason knew there was still more work to be done. The case had exposed the flaws in the system, but it had also highlighted the deeper, more troubling issues that had been overlooked for years. Officer Harris wasn't the only one with a history of misconduct. Jason knew that his fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The phone call came on a quiet evening, just as Jason was settling in for the night. It was the judge from his trial. Jason hadn't expected to hear from him again. The judge's voice was low, almost regretful. "Jason," he said, "I've been thinking about your case and about what you've exposed. I can't promise you anything, but there are others who are willing to listen. There might be a chance to make things right, but it's going to take time. We'll need you." Jason didn't hesitate. He had known all along that exposing the truth was just the beginning. It wasn't enough to win one case. The system had to change, and if it took every ounce of his strength to make it happen, he would do it. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. As he set the phone down, Jason took a deep breath. His journey had been long, full of obstacles, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He had faced the system and won, but now he would take on the system as a whole. It was no longer just about him. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, and wronged. With a renewed sense of purpose, Jason stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city below. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Jason's incredible journey. What do you think of his bold move to represent himself in court, revealing not only the lies of Officer Harris, but also exposing a deeper systemic issue? Do you believe justice was truly served, or is this just the beginning of a larger fight for accountability? How do you feel about Jason's strategy in the courtroom? His calm confidence and methodical approach seem to have been key in turning the tide against an officer who was trusted by the system. Do you think the justice system is truly fair, or do you think cases like this happen more often than we realize? Let us know where you're watching from, and share your opinions on how Jason's victory might impact future cases of injustice. What would you have done in his position? We're eager to hear your perspectives, and your comments help keep the conversation going. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to catch more incredible stories like this one. The fight for justice doesn't stop here, and we've got so many more powerful stories to share with you in the days ahead.